Hi everybody, hopefully you watched the video that I had posted on my Weebly that is attached right here in your notes about the placebo effect. Why do you think people in the video got stronger even though they weren't really given anything? The reason for that is because they thought they should be stronger. I should spell should wrong. Oops. So maybe they actually tried harder. So if you're thinking about the video, my plan this time is to use a beverage to test the effect that caffeine can have on heart rate. This is very near and dear to my heart because I am addicted to caffeine, coffee rather than cola. So what we're going to do is measure the initial pulse rate, give each student some caffeine, wait for some amount of time, measure the final pulse rate, and then compare final and initial rates. So we're going to look for that difference in heart rate. There's a lot of problems with this plan. The first one I see is there is nothing to compare to so without caffeine. This is actually called a control group. So your control group means they don't get any sort of treatment. So there's a lack of control group here. And then also, there's not just caffeine here, there's also sugar, and you all know that sugar rushes are real. So sugar might also increase the heart rate. I'm going to use HR for heart rate. Okay. So there's a control group, and then we also need to control other variables that might have an effect on our result. Another thing that might happen is that people know they're getting a treatment, so they might have the placebo effect happen. That's why it's important to do what we call blinding, which means the subjects, and sometimes the experimenters, don't know who's getting which treatment. So those are some 3 key ideas that we need to know for a good experiment. So those would be your suggestions for these 3 problems, right? So if we're going to design an experiment for this test, if we're affecting caffeine, or if we're testing the effect caffeine has on heart rate, we need to actually take the students and randomly split them into 2 groups. Sorry, I'll slide that up. So we need to take the students and randomly split them into 2 groups. One group gets regular cola. And the other group gets caffeine-free. Then what we're going to do is compare the change in heart rate. Right? So once again, if we're looking at a completely randomized design, We're trying to make this as ideal as possible. What we're going to do is randomly pick 100 students. And what you're going to do is randomly assign them so you can use your calculator, a bowl with slips of paper on it and their names, mix it up, draw them out of a hat. But either way, you're going to randomly assign each student to one of two groups. There's group 1 with 50 students, and then there's group 2 with 50 students. And remember, group 1 gets treatment number 1, which is the Coca-Cola, the regular version. And then group 2 is going to get the caffeine-free And then what we're going to do with these is compare the differences in heart rates and see if one has a bigger increase in heart rate than the second one. So remember, we're comparing the change in heart rates. So each group will have a before and after measurement, right? So this is a great example of how to draw an experimental design. We're going to have to model this quite a bit in the future. So yeah, your textbook has a great way of doing this as well, okay? So you can check out the summary page right before you start your homework, and this will be really helpful to help with how to design the experiment properly, right? Next, what we're going to do is discuss the big ideas from designing experiments, so 4.2 day 2. There are a lot of different things that we talked about. So one big idea was a control group. This one, it's actually used to provide baseline data for comparison. So the control group gets that control treatment. So in this case, it would have been the caffeine-free Coca-Cola. Another thing we talked about is blinding. This is used to reduce the effects of placebo effect. So if subjects, this is called single blind. If it's just the subjects, it's single blind. But if you include the experimenters, if they don't know what treatment was assigned, this can reduce the placebo effect. So it can also reduce bias. So the experimenter can have some bias itself. So me personally, I wouldn't like to think that my heart rate shoots up every time I drink caffeine because I want to feel like a healthy person. So maybe I would bias the results a little bit. So once again, blinding can reduce experimenter bias and the placebo effect. Which is, in my words, a fake treatment works. Which is bad. Okay? Another thing we discussed and included implicitly are 4 key principles of experiments. The first one is comparing 2 or more treatments. Usually, if it's just 2, one is the treatment and the other one's a control. So once again, you want to compare 2 or more treatments. So maybe we want to put some Diet Coke in there too, which has caffeine, but the aspartame instead of sugar. The second principle that we need to talk about is random assignment. This is huge. By randomly assigning, you're going to use chance to assign treatments to your experimental units. Random assignment truly helps to try to make as equal groups as possible, meaning if I'm randomly assigning 50 to one group, 50 to the other, ideally we're going to have 2 groups with the same types of people or some of the same types of people, so it's easier to compare that data. The third thing that we're going to do is control. So the control is keep all other variables besides the treatments constant. Meaning everyone should get the same amount of sugar in their caffeine intake, if that makes sense. So whether or not they have caffeine, they should have the same amount of sugar in their pop. The last thing that we need to be able to do is replicate, meaning we need to be able to repeat this study and have enough experimental units that basically just means your sample size is good. So you need to have enough experimental units to distinguish a difference. And this gets to the idea of the bigger the sample size, the better, right? So ideally, if you have a huge sample size, you're going to have enough data to create a more valid study to make this more accurate. So what I want to do is have you all try this, check your understanding. So you're going to pause the video, check your understanding, and then I'll put the answer key up shortly. All right? All right, so here we are. Here's the check your understanding. So first and foremost, it says explain why it's important to have a control group. The control group allows us to see how much electricity we normally use, so that way we have baseline data to compare to at the end. When you go to randomly assign treatments, please make sure that you are following all of the proper steps. Remember, the first one is label. Then you need to actually describe how you're randomizing. So if you're using a calculator, here's your function. Then you need to select your 20 and identify those houses. Remember, you're looking for unique numbers, so you get unique houses. Then you're going to repeat this to fill the next 2 groups. So once you have your first 20 into the first group, then you're going to randomly select 20 unique ones that you haven't already selected. And then the last 20 will go into group 3. Something that's really important is the reasoning for randomly assigning treatments. The idea is that you get roughly equivalent groups. So maybe you have 5 really high income households in each group. Random assignment is supposed to try to take care of not putting certain types of homes all into one group. So if you do it by location, it might cause problems. But if you randomly assign just out of a big pool, then hopefully you should have an equal distribution of each type of home. If you look at this experiment, you start with your 60 homes. You're going to randomly assign them to groups, which is described up in Part B. Give them each of the treatments, and then you want to compare the change in electricity usage. So check my Weebly for the homework assignment today, and then be all set. Yay!